seated. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. I trust that you're all enjoying the beautiful service this morning. You know, with all the goings on in our community, the focus of so many of you, based on your phone calls to me and from people outside of the Jewish community, is the need, the desire, the urgency to become vaccinated. Now, of course, this is not necessarily a problem in Israel, where I know they're so far ahead with their vaccination program. And the reason is that having safe and effective vaccines against COVID, it's wonderful news. And I know that Israel is working on new vaccines at the moment. And yes, it moves us closer to an eventual return of normalcy. But if they're in short supply, then how does it help those who are in need? With not enough vaccines to go around, everyone, both on an individual level and on a national level, is scrambling to secure vaccinations for everybody. And anytime there is a shortage, there's going to be haves and have-nots. And the way the world generally works, the haves manage to get taken care of. The rich and rich nations aren't used to having to wait their turn. And we've seen this play out here in our beloved Canada in a couple of different ways. And I want to share with you a couple of stories, and then we're going to tie it into this Torah portion to see how it actually comes together. And there are a number of Canadian snowbirds who spend part of the year in Florida. And amongst them, there are those who chartered private jets to get to Florida in order to be vaccinated there. Before you criticize, you should know that Florida permits this. The state is vaccinating everyone over 65, and they don't care if you're a citizen or not. I can tell you who's not happy, and that's our Prime Minister, Trudeau. He isn't happy about it. He has repeatedly said that the snowbirds should stay home. He also said that there will be no repatriation efforts for people who find themselves stuck abroad. And international travelers who get sick after they return are not going to be eligible for financial subsidies by the government. On the other hand, Evan Ryszkowski, spokesperson for the Canadian Snowbird Association, sees it as a good thing. He said Canadian seniors receiving a vaccination in Florida at their own expense means that they're not going to take vaccines away from Canadians who can't travel. Valid point, can't argue with that. But then you might remember a story from last month, a story which became national, had a national outcry about a couple from Vancouver who flew over 1,000 miles in a private plane to Beaver Creek in the Yukon in order to get vaccinated. The difference here is the couple violated a number of rules. They were supposed to quarantine in Whitehorse. That was their first stopover. That was their stop before they could go on to Beaver Creek. And then they lied to officials in Beaver Creek. They pretended to be workers at a local motel. The community was selected for vaccines by the government because it was so remote. And they have a population of elderly and high-risk First Nations people. Angela Dermott, the chief of the White River First Nation, said, "We are deeply concerned by the actions of individuals who put our elders and vulnerable people to risk in order to jump the line for selfish purposes." And then there's what we're doing as a nation. Canada has been on a vaccine buying spree. Canada has contracts for more vaccines per capita than any other nation. Nearly 9 doses for each and every Canadian. It was recently revealed that Canada was procuring 1.9 million vaccines for COVAX. And those of you who don't know what COVAX is an entity that Canada and other countries fund to buy COVID-19 vaccines in bulk and deliver them to poor nations that aren't able to compete with wealthier nations. And thus they're able to secure vaccine contracts from drug companies. Canada alone invested $440 million in COVAX last September, intending for half the money to go for vaccines for Canada and half for the developing nations. Now, Stephen Lewis, former UN Special Envoy for HIV and AIDS in Africa, says it's wrong for Canada to take these vaccines. They should go to poor countries. He went on to say, the Liberty, listen to this. He went on to say, Canada is the first G7 country to take vaccines through COVAX, intended for poor countries. Prime Minister Trudeau, he defended the move, saying it was always the intent to both help poor nations and to secure more vaccines through COVAX. Who's right? How are we supposed to conduct ourselves in the face of these shortages? Now, this week's Torah portion, Mishpatim, as I said to you earlier, contains 53 commands. The vast majority of them have to do with ethical issues. We have rules about how to treat slaves. Even slaves, according to the Torah, have certain rights. And I explained to you why and how it comes that we as Jews in those early times had slaves. It was nothing to do with us working our slaves. But I'm not going to get into that now. You can always go back, and if you want, listen to last night's sermon. It should be up on the website on Monday. So slaves have certain rights, and slave owners have responsibilities toward their slaves. We have rules about assault. We have rules about what happens if your ox gores someone and how you treat a hired worker. We are told to lend to the poor and destitute and not to afflict a widow or an orphan. We're also told the punishment for a thief. The Jewish tradition is clearly very concerned with ethical behavior. So how do we make sense of the 3 stories that I gave you in the opening? Is it okay for rich people to do whatever they can to get vaccinated first? Is it okay for Canada to take vaccines from a fund intended to support poor nations when it has already secured a pipeline for enough vaccines to protect every Canadian several times over? Each scenario has to be evaluated on its own terms. But there are some general principles in halakha that we can apply to them. First of all, there is a famous principle of pikuach nefesh, of saving lives. A person is allowed to violate any commandment, including theft, to save a life, other than the 3 cardinal sins of sexual impropriety, idol worship, and murder. You're not allowed to murder an innocent person to save your own life. And as the Talmud says, how do you know that your blood is redder than his? Perhaps his blood is redder than yours. We are, however, allowed to prioritize our own life over the life of others. And an example is given in the Talmud, which says as follows. If 2 people are walking across the desert and there is only enough water for one of them to make it, rather than sharing the water with the result of both dying, The person whose water it is should drink it himself and survive. Now, Rabbi Akiva taught this based on the verse, and your brother shall live with you, not instead of you. And of course, there are well-known prohibitions against theft and against bearing false witness is one of the 10 commandments, and we spoke about that last week, so I'm not going to go into it again. But in this first case, the snowbirds who go down to Florida to get vaccinated, it seems there's nothing wrong with what they're doing. They're not lying about anything. They're not cheating anybody else. They are eligible for the vaccine under the rules of the state of Florida. That's the end of it. Now, one could argue whether the rule in Florida is a sensible rule or not, but that's irrelevant. There are enough laws and enough rules that the governments make that are insensible. But they're entitled to the vaccine under those rules, so they are not taking a vaccine away from someone who is entitled to it when they themselves are not. Is it fair that they can do this while others cannot? Maybe not, but fair isn't the same as ethical. And there's nothing wrong with what they are doing. On the other hand, what the couple who flew from Vancouver to Beaver Creek did was wrong on many levels. Under the rules of the Yukon Territory, those vaccines were intended for a particular community. And by misrepresenting themselves, the couple was stealing vaccines from their rightful owners. What they did was theft. It was giving false testimony, and it cannot be justified under Pikuach Nefesh, because you are not allowed to hurt someone else to save yourself. In the case of Canada taking vaccines from COVAX, it would appear that the Prime Minister is correct. If Canada paid for those vaccines, we are the equivalent of the man with the water in the example in the Talmud. We don't have to sacrifice our lives to save somebody else's life. And in the case that the vaccines were contracted for and paid for by Canada, makes them ours. Every nation is doing what it can to protect its own citizens first, which is in keeping with the Rambam, with Maimonides, and his teaching on the hierarchy of charity, which basically says charity begins at home. Your people take precedence in charity. And it's really just a question of timing. Obviously, Canada doesn't need to vaccinate its citizens 9 times over. But what is the government trying to do? The government is trying to get vaccines for Canadians as quickly as possible. And the excess vaccines won't go to waste. Undoubtedly, they will be sent to other nations as soon as Canada has taken care of its own. People ask, how was it that Israel was able to get vaccines so fast over and above everybody else? And one of the reasons was because the government of Israel was prepared to pay any price for the vaccines to make sure each and every one of their citizens was taken care of. Rumor has it that they paid up to 4 times the price to Pfizer. A huge sum of money. But we see exactly where, in this particular case, their responsibility fell. Canada, in fact, can be very proud that it has donated hundreds of millions of dollars for vaccines for nations that are less well off. As Thomas Paine said, these are the times that try men's souls. We need to be aware that we are certainly allowed to do what we can do to take care of ourselves, as the nation is doing, and as those snowbirds are doing. without crossing a line where we unethically take something that is not ours. So let us remember, that is the lesson that we can derive from this week's Torah portion. And with that, I wish you Shabbat Shalom.